Hey, this is Sarah Hodgson with another episode of Life Unleashed. I'm excited to be with you here today. I love the topic. It's dog aggression. We're going to sink our teeth into it. First of all, I want to clear the air about what aggression is and what aggression isn't. If your dog's excitable, they jump, they bark, they even mouth a person while greeting them, that isn't necessarily aggression. Most often, a dog that's kind of playful is an assertive dog who just hasn't learned good manners yet. Aggression, on the other hand, is a distinct reaction to feeling threatened or overstimulated. It can have various postures. A dog could be erect with their tail up and their body stiff. They could also be pulling back. If you notice the face of a dog, that can be very telling. They're often showing their teeth. Their lips are pulled back in a grimace. Their eyes look different than their resting, happy posture. Often the hair of their back is also sticking up. This is known as a pileoerection. And there are many different types and different situations where aggression comes into play. There's territorial aggression. There's possessive or resource guarding. There's a dog who is fearful or frustrated, displacing their aggression on someone who's not even the target of their aggravation. There are other types of aggression. Aggression is used in social conflict, in sexual interaction, in maternal situations, pain-induced, predatory. I'm sure there's some I've left out. And a dog might use one type of aggression while not using others. So in other words, there's no one definition. There's no black and white definition of aggression. It's a overstimulated reaction to unpredictable situations. Today, our focus is what's known as reactive aggression, the type most seen in everyday life, which is most often stimulated by fear. It's a fear they're losing control of their personal space. It's a fear that they can't predict what is going to happen next. I can't stress enough that if your dog does use aggression, they are not a bad dog. It's simply one way they have of coping with a situation that feels out of control. Many dogs can change, learning to utilize other parts of their brain to cope with or calm an uncomfortable situation. Even I act aggressive with my husband sometimes, and sometimes even my kids. So I am learning, dogs can learn, we all can learn, and I'm excited to welcome my guest, Stanley Coren, to this episode of Life Unleashed. Stanley is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia, a neuropsychology researcher, and the author of over 20 books on the science and history of dog behavior, including The Intelligence of Dogs, How to Speak Dog, and most recently, The Fascinating Folklore and Mythology of Dogs. When Stanley and I were working together on our book, Understanding Your Dogs for Dummies, something he said has stuck with me. When a dog uses aggression, actually makes contact, fighting with another dog or biting a person, the brain releases a powerful hormone that satisfies the dog, much in the same way a drug addict is satisfied by the drug of their choice. Since then, there has been so many breakthroughs on the intrapsychic nature of aggression. And Stanley, I'd love to start our talk, exploring that.
Well, you have to understand that our dogs, even that little Havanese lying beside you, is basically a domesticated wolf, and they're predators and carnivores. So they are wired to use aggression as a tool. What we've done by domesticating them is we have toned that way down, but we haven't eliminated.
So you're talking about genetics, like we have genetically tampered their impulsivity to use aggression when they feel threatened or startled or afraid.
Yes. We have lots of recent examples of our controlling aggression in dogs genetically. I don't know whether you remember, but way back before the devil dogs were pit bulls. In the 50s and early 60s, the devil dogs,
German Shepherds.
oh, Dobermans.
Oh, I grew up with Dobermans.
Yes.
They are the sweetest.
But in the 50s and 60s, they were considered to be the devil dogs. And the Doberman owners, the Doberman Club, decided that, they were worried that some sort of bad dog law was going to be passed against their breed. So they did something really very heroic. They decided that they would pull the breeding certificate on any Doberman which showed spontaneous aggression. That means to say, aggressed without being provoked. And in less than 10 years, they turned Dobermans to what we have now, which is this wonderful working guarding breed. They will aggress, but only when provoked. But that's here in North America. In Europe, they still want their Dobermans to have what they call temperamental fire. That's an example of how we can control part of the aggressive predisposition in our dogs simply through breeding.
But Stanley, what do you make of the fact that aggression in dogs is higher in the United States? And all these studies going on that show aggression can be more prevalent in dogs who are neutered.
Well, I think the single factor which predisposes North America to have higher aggressive rates is spaying and neutering.
Really?
Throughout Europe, for example, spaying and neutering is very rare.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
So what do the shelters do there with all their mixed breed and unwanted dogs? They leave them intact?
Well, yes. I mean, their shelters leave their dogs intact. Here in North America, something in the vicinity of 90% of all of the dogs are spayed or neutered. Whereas in Europe, something like about only 20% of all dogs are spayed or neutered. There have been a number of studies, and some of them are really quite large. For example, there was a study coming out of Australia which looked at close to 10,000 dogs, and they found that the male dogs who have been neutered are more than 3 times more likely to be involved in aggressive incidents.
Regardless of breed.
Regardless of breed. And the variable, which is most important in this case, is the amount of time that the dogs have lived without spaying and neutering. So the younger the dogs are spayed and neutered, the more likely it is that they are going to be aggressive. That's exactly the opposite of what veterinarians have been telling us. And this is not a one-off study. I mean, in the past 6 or 7 years, there have been 3 major studies, all of which had huge numbers of dogs involved. As I said, the one in Australia was close to 10,000 dogs, but there have been 2 other studies, one with 6,000 and one with 4,000 dogs. And so we're looking at huge sample sizes here.
Well, Stanley, take us inside the dog's brain, because the one thing people don't recognize, I believe, is that testosterone is not simply involved in the sexual nature of dogs. It's in the brain development. And what I know has been a big part of the study is the brain's amygdala, the mechanism of how aggression is mapped in the brain. So you can maybe say some more on that, and also on how testosterone, when removed in a young dog, would affect the nature of the brain and thus affect the nature of maybe that dog using aggression. Do you think there's like a parallel?
Well, it certainly has to do with the availability of the sex hormones. We know that they are involved in the maturation of neural cells.
There you go.
Including some of them in the brain, and certainly some of them impact on the limbic system, which is going to control all of those aggressive tendencies.
Does that lead to more hyperactivity and reactivity in a dog? Like, what is the limbic system? What does that control?
Well, the limbic system controls a whole bunch of stuff. It's located in the middle of the brain, sort of under all of that cortical stuff. And at the very end of the limbic system are the amygdala, which are I always look at it as the bite part of the brain. And it also includes things having to do with the way that memories are laid down and to a smaller extent, emotional regulation. So think of it as not which emotions show, but how intense those emotions will be. Now, the argument which is made by a lot of people is, well, we have to keep down the overpopulation
Sure.
of dogs, especially in
It's
shelters.
insane.
But there are ways to do that which are not going to destroy the dog's behavior. For example, you can do a vasectomy on a dog. That will stop the dog from breeding. And it's actually cheaper and less invasive than the removal of the testicles, but it leaves the normal hormone production alone. And in females, you don't have to do what is virtually a hysterectomy, which will take out not just the ovaries, but will stop the production of the female sex hormones. You can do an ovary sparing, basically a ligature, getting a tubes tied. And again, it's considerably less invasive, but leaves the hormones alone. Now, there's only been one study, and it's a very recent one, which has looked at the differences between the traditional way of spaying and neutering and tubes tying or vasectomies. And in that one, it showed exactly what one would have expected.
Now, since my audience is largely going to be based in America, I've heard a lot of what are touted as conspiracy theories that there are not very many veterinarians doing this type of surgery. Those that are take some finding. The majority of the veterinarians are still doing the old school, what's taught to them in vet school, what everybody here is used to. So, for many of my listeners, this may be a whole new topic of consideration. Are there veterinarians being trained? Are there veterinarians coming from Europe who are now working in the States? Let's say Peekaboo has her litter. She's a litter coming up, and I want to get her tubes tied, and I don't want to go through those traditional means. Is Canada doing that? Are there veterinarians who are paying attention to these studies? I know, and it's such a heartbreak to me that many 8-week-old puppies are coming home from the shelter on heavy antibiotics. They've already been spayed or neutered. Even the people who are adopting them regret that invasive surgery being done at such a young age. Are there studies being done on these dogs where the neutering is done, before they've even cut their milk teeth?
I hope that there are studies being done. As I said, the this new one is quite recent, and the procedures are not all that difficult. I mean, they're actually simpler than the traditional thing. I mean, if you're going to tie off the tubes, for example, that's a lot less involved than, castrating the dog or doing a full hysterectomy. And the situation is that you can even do for the male dogs basically a needle vasectomy.
You've got to be kidding. Like, it sounds so easy.
Relatively speaking, it is.
You or I couldn't do it. Like, when you're explaining all this and I'm really thinking about the dog, it's terribly invasive what they're doing to these animals. I mean, they're just carving them up, basically.
Yes, yes, that's true. And it's unfortunate. It's more traditional. I mean, you were talking before about conspiracy theories, but when I published an article describing this research, one of the people who responded to the article wrote back and said, well, the reason they're not doing these ligatures and are doing full out surgery is because it's more profitable. I don't think that that's the case for the vast majority of vets. I think that they simply follow what has become standard
Right.
practice in North
Right.
America.
It would be great if they could learn both ways. I would even pay the same amount to have a simpler surgery. Like, to me, it wouldn't matter. You can charge me whatever you want, but I would rather do something that's less invasive or dangerous to my dog's health, money aside.
Yeah, I mean, so would I. I mean, if the simple issue is to control reproduction, then you use the simplest way possible.
Right.
There's a
Right.
rule of thumb in psychology which says don't muck with the hormones. And that's basically what we're doing here. by doing the simpler operation, you allow the normal hormonal balance to stay in force.
And I love what you said before for the dog's sexuality, but isn't these sexual hormones, aren't they also tied to muscle growth, brain development? Aren't they used for so much more than just sexual intent?
Yes, and that's really
I
quite
don't think
important.
people know that, right?
They're even involved in such basic things as the development of bone density. I mean, this they are blood-based hormones,
Distributed in the blood.
so they ultimately can impact every part of your neurology and every part of your development.
That's so fascinating.
And as I said, in Europe, there is a lot more hesitation about doing those sorts of operations.
Stanley, can you say something on the genetics and if any studies have been done on the rise in aggression in toy breeds? There are certain dogs that are bred for aggression. Terriers are bred to go to the ground and kill vermin. So they have a high prey drive and a high kill drive, whereas a Doberman or Shepherd is less aggressive but uses reactive techniques to protect their personal space. And just the rise in overall aggression. So we have neutering as one factor that I agree has just grown in propensity with the massive population bloom of dogs. Now, again, it can be traced back to, well, the population bloom because they weren't neutered and you need them. But when you're focusing on aggression, you've made a perfect argument on many levels. What are some other things that you feel are factoring into the modern dog's propensity to use aggression to protect their space? I have a darling little teacup pom that imprinted with us 4 months ago and came back, was using aggression when her harness was put on, had severe stranger danger. And in the few weeks we had her, we were able to calm that fear. So she now licks to communicate her displeasure rather than bites. But there's so many other factors that go into a dog using aggression as well.
I think that the rise of aggression in dogs in North America, number one factor is early spaying and neutering. The number two factor has to do with punishment. And this is punishment even in terms of training, leash jerks and swatting at the dog and that sort of thing. There have been, I can't even count the number of studies which have shown that dogs who are exposed to punishment in any form in their living environment or are trained using aversive techniques.
Shock collars, they're passing them off as vibrating TENS collars, but they're all the same, correct?
Well, we're talking about things which actually hurt the dog, okay? So a leash jerk, swatting the dog for misbehavior, and that sort of thing. The data is really quite unambiguous, and some of the studies have been quite remarkable, where they've actually gone out and found dog training schools in which the trainers are biased toward either positive training or traditional training or what tends to be called discipline training and that sort of thing, and have shown that the dogs with the harsher training procedures are much more likely to be aggressive, to show aggression. And they are in the two forms of aggression which we worry about the most, which is aggression toward strangers and aggressive toward family. The argument, which has been made by a number of researchers, is the reason that this happens is because by punishing a dog, you are basically showing the dog that aggression is an acceptable part of the interaction between the dog and the people around him. If you use alternate methods other than punishment, then that never becomes an issue because the dog essentially doesn't learn that aggression is permitted in that particular setting. And it also explains an interesting finding which keeps popping up, which shows that a dog who is on leash tends to be considerably less likely to engage in aggressive behavior, even if, for example, it is threatened by another dog.
Now, I see a lot of leash reactivity in my practice as a dog trainer. My explanation to people is metaphorically, when you pull on a leash, you're eliciting oppositional reflex, much like me dragging you around by your shirt. Now, I would think that a dog, especially a dog on a choke collar or even a harness, is going to feel trapped and thus more aggressive. You're saying that's not been shown.
There are things which an owner can do on the leash. So, for example, if they haul back on a leash, their dog's front legs go off the ground. The dog is basically rising up. Another dog facing that dog will look at that as a challenge.
Absolutely.
But we're talking about a dog who is not being manhandled on the leash,
Right.
just simply the existence of the leash itself.
I always say holding a leash should be like holding someone's hand. It should be a relaxed, engaging, interactive exercise.
That's right. And in fact, the argument is made that as far as the dog is concerned, the leash is an extension of your hand.
Right.
And that is one of the reasons why they don't feel quite as insecure.
So you're saying when they're held correctly on a leash.
That's right.
But Stanley, when dogs are off a leash, aren't they more prone to work out their differences? Don't they want to maintain a sense of calm by not engaging in, a fracas?
Well, it would be really nice if we could say there were no bullies in the schoolyard. But, you had asked why, for example, there is a rise in dog aggression here in North America. And part of that rise is due to, well, I'm going to call it a regression in the methods of dog training. We now have people who, like Cesar Millan and a number of his clones, who have TV shows and podcasts and that sort of thing. And they are advocating what they call discipline-based training, which involves, in many instances, using extremely harsh corrections.
I've seen it, and I've seen the dogs look terrified. Isn't that look of terror? I always try to explain it as the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic. So parasympathetic is congenial, rest and digest. The dog feels safe and comforted. And like you said, you want them to always feel that way in their home, like they can trust that sense of love. And then the sympathetic, which is fight, flight, or freeze, which I think is brought on board when dogs are mistreated by their people and they learn to mistrust people.
Well, aggression can be triggered. One of the major triggers of aggression is fear. And in fact, fear biters are one of the most difficult type of dogs to treat.
I always say aggression is the bodyguard of fear.
And Job Michael Evans, I don't know whether you remember him, but
he was my mentor.
He was your mentor. Okay.
And then you were my next mentor. I got the best.
Well, if he was your mentor, then you probably remember him saying that if you have a fear biter, you have only a 5% chance of being able to fix that dog completely. So you're right. It is the sympathetic nervous system which is involved in producing all of those particular responses. Straight aggression, straight dominance aggression, is actually easy to fix in dogs.
For our viewers, what is straight up dominance aggression?
All right, dominance aggression is simply a dog basically claiming that it has higher status and has more of a right to certain resources.
Right. So they're not dominant all the time, but with regards to certain resources, they have the more dominant status, and thus are using aggression to protect that resource?
Yeah, that's right. Or their social status, sort of their access to affection and that sort of thing. So in terms of danger, dominant aggressive dog has less of a chance of harming other individuals, because if they get what they want, then they stop, okay?
Right.
Whereas a fear aggressive dog, if you back away from a fear aggressive dog, instead of stopping its sort of defensive aggression, it might look at that as an opportunity to attack you to protect itself.
So, Stanley, if I enter a house, or this is often explained to me that someone will come in, the dog will bark, they'll turn to walk away from them, and that's when the dog goes and bites their calf. That would be considered a fear aggressive response, correct?
That's right. And it's also the reason, for example, you're more likely to get a dog biting the leash if it's afraid. And remember, the dog is viewing that leash as being an extension of your hand. So the fear aggressive dog is the one who you worry about. It's going to be the dog who's most likely to cause injury.
Now, Stanley, I know some of our listeners might have a puppy or even my sweet Peaky who's sitting on my lap. She does love when we walk, I call it walk the dog. So she'll walk herself. If I'm walking two dogs, she loves to carry the leash. I have a little puppy. I tell people just relax. It's normal for them to carry something. They often grab their leash. That's not necessarily a symptom of fear aggression.
No,
Explain what you're talking about.
I'm talking about the dog will be showing all of the typical body language for fear. The dog will be showing its teeth, but it will look as though an aggressive display from the mouth is sort of C-shaped, okay? You can see the dog's teeth. A fear grimace is the mouth looks as though you pulled back the corners of the mouth and you can see the gums as well as the teeth. The eyes tend to be more hooded in a fear aggression. In a dominance aggression, they're wide. The ears are slicked down. The fear aggressive dog will also tend to lower its body somewhat, whereas a dominant aggressive will have stiff front legs and seem to be leaning forward. And the fear aggressive dog, the tail will be slightly lowered. In the dominant aggressive dog, the tail is often very high above the body.
You were talking about when a fear aggressive dog grabs the leash versus playfully wanting to tug or just wanting to carry something.
Well, the fear aggressive dog doesn't grab the leash, he bites the leash. So it'll be rah, 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 rah.
He wants to sever it.
Yes, or lashes out at you, assuming that you somehow or another are sensitive to his actions on the leash.
Now that crosses over to displaced aggression, where the dog will be angry or frustrated and then turn to react to another person. But these just highlight how many different types of aggression they are. And I always stress to people the emotion at the base most often is fear. Sometimes it's frustration. And the body language, like you said, is different. It's really an art form, learning to read, and it's such an embedded topic.
There's a study coming out of Japan which looked at people's ability to recognize aggression in dogs.
You wrote about this in Psychology Today.
Yes. And the study in Japan looked at people's ability to recognize aggression. But what they did was rather interesting. They actually monitored what the people were looking at. They used eye movement monitors. And they found out that, in fact, most people tend to look at the dog's head and face. But of course, most of the signals, the best signals for impending aggression, are body language. People did not do very well at recognizing aggression. And the researchers concluded the reason it is because they're not looking at the right places. They're looking at the face and they're not looking at the rest of the body.
So fascinating, because like we just talked of two of the postures and how distinctly different there are. And there's so many different times, and even some dogs can have conflicted aggression or, and I always tell people, listen, there's so many different types of aggression. If your dog's showing territorial aggression, it doesn't necessarily mean he'll also be predatory. He could have multiple types of aggression, but I try to help people see the bright side, because now we're talking about reactionary aggression. There are ways to de-escalate a dog. There are ways to teach them different coping skills. And I find just like people, or most people, they would rather not feel so threatened in everyday situations if they had a choice, if they knew a better way to manage. And that's where the dog training, understanding the dog's aggression, being able to categorize it, being able to isolate triggers, being able to teach dogs other behaviors that make them happy, whether that's tug of war or, finding some treats or chasing a ball. So many people just feel like their dog is broken when they show aggression or they're hopeless. And so many dogs just need to be shown a new way to relate to their world. We didn't even get into the importance of early socialization, so dogs are not spooked by everyday noises and situation. But Stanley, I know your time is so valuable. I hope you'll come back.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Stanley. Today's subject was dog aggression. A big shout out to Stanley Coren. Check out Stanley on his website, stanleycoren.com. And meanwhile, I'm signing off now, but I look forward to seeing you back here next week. Bye-bye.